Well, welcome back, everybody. We're really excited to talk today to Dr. Theresa Burriss, who's an independent, multidisciplinary Appalachian studies scholar and educator. Thank you so much for joining us today, Theresa.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm looking forward to speaking with you all.
Great, thanks. And I'm really excited to have this discussion because I'm looking forward to welcoming you to UMW later this summer in July for the Reimagining the Liberal Arts in the Age of AI conference. And you're one of our keynote speakers, which I'm looking forward to.
Thank you. I was very honored when Brenta Blevins invited me to speak. So hopefully I will contribute to the discussion.
Well, I remember her telling the rest of the organizing committee about seeing you speak at another conference and how happy she was with that discussion and really wanted to bring that to campus. So I'm glad we have a chance to do that. I want to ask you a little bit about that keynote so that we can kind of whet the appetite of everybody that's watching so they have a sense of what to look forward to. And tell us a little bit about the title, because the title starts with mend a story. And what I love about that is that both of those words, mend and story, are really pulling in some really interesting perspectives already to think about mending rather than even reconciling and trying to recapture or correct something, and then thinking of it as a story as opposed to an argument. Tell us a little bit about that. How do you put that together and how do you envision it?
Well, I love that you have picked up the symbolism is important, but let me say this. Mend is actually the title of a painting that my artist friend Suzanne Strike gifted me. And it is of a spider in the middle of a web, and the title of her painting is Mend. But it is very fitting in this context, like you said, of there seems to be some kind of friction or disruption, if you will, and we are mending it. But the way that I started thinking about this and reconciling authenticity and AI, I used Suzanne's painting as a launching pad. And instead of writing her a traditional thank you note, I decided to write her on my own without using AI, a poem. Well, my psychologist husband, he is a scientist, he's not a creative, used AI and fed it with prompts. He used Copilot and generated a poem to give to Suzanne. So this is where this actually originated. But I think that, to your point, I mean, that's really mend in the story. But as an Appalachian studies scholar, I feel like stories are a way to invite people into conversation in a non-threatening way, as opposed to the argument. And so it really fits in both capacities to demonstrate where AI fits in our lives.
I love that sense of maybe even fitting AI and humanity into this web. That's something to explore. I like that.
Definitely.
Yeah, and you mentioned this like a bit, with the authenticity, right? But I know in the keynote, right, it sets up kind of this authenticity, this artificiality. Right? They're in like tension, right? But it's not something to overcome. It's just like, well, we can kind of live in this tension, right? And maybe there's a question of like how to live well within the tension. Like, do you have any kind of thoughts or reflections on that?
I very much do. In fact, one of the things that I talk about with Suzanne's painting, yes, it is an authentic painting, but it is not the web and the spider in and of themselves. It is a representation of that. So even that is problematized, the authenticity of that web and spider. And Stefan, to your point, I think that all of us live with tensions in our lives, whether we name them as such or even acknowledge them. And one of the issues that I talk about in particular, and it derives from feminist theory, but I use it in an Appalachian context, and this is a tension. What does it mean when I live with the tension of Appalachia in the singular and Appalachias in the plural? Because going back to feminist theory, there is political might, if you will, in unity and rallying around a particular identity. But in that process, the diversity within that unity is lost. So I think that here again, whether humans overtly acknowledge it or not, we live in constant tensions. I think that some people want to avoid that because it's uncomfortable. But it is inevitable, is my thought.
That discomfort is a really interesting aspect of it. And living in tension, or existing in that kind of tension sometimes is really productive, as uncomfortable as it might be. And that's another aspect of this when we're thinking about authenticity that I wanted to ask you about. You reference in the abstract about the keynote talking about existentialism, and thinking about even kind of juxtaposing or presenting different positions there from Kierkegaard to Nietzsche. And there's some natural tension there between their perspectives as, maybe living more with a religious self before God versus self-creation from another perspective. Do you think that maybe there's one of those accounts of authenticity that sits better with you? Do you think might be more useful? Is there a benefit of having that tension between the two as we start to explore it?
So I default to Derrida and deconstruction, that it is typically a both and. Rarely is it an either or. And because I was a philosophy major at Emory University and took an entire semester seminar on Nietzsche, I lean a bit more towards Nietzsche just in certain arguments, I will say. But I think that all of the existentialists invite us to consider our place in the world. And each person has to determine what philosophy resonates with them the most. Kierkegaard is certainly going to resonate stronger with some of my friends who are very much religiously aligned. Whereas Nietzsche, I will say, thinking about Nietzsche and the herd, here again, I studied him ad nauseum. You never, I used to be, I was just talking to somebody recently about this. I used to be a strict existentialist in the sense that I thought you were born as a blank slate. Then I became a mother. And I realized that was folly, that there is definitely, talk about tension. There is a tension between nature and nurture. And my two sons definitely they came into this world prescribed certain ways, that it didn't matter what the nurture was, the nature was there. So even a philosopher is going to be complicated. And what does Walt Whitman say? Do I contradict myself? I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes.
Let me ask you a little bit about this, because I think you're right. There are limits to that tabula rasa approach that, we could be just a blank slate. And Stefan and I both studied a lot of philosophy. I was an undergraduate philosophy major as well and studied rhetoric. And what I always enjoyed about that was the sense of that inherent contradiction, the conflict, the discomfort. And so I want to go back to something you said earlier about why it's story versus argument, because there's an access point, and there is an attempt at an access of comfort to be able to welcome people in. Not many philosophical discussions are that welcoming necessarily or that comfortable. So I'm wondering how you view that tension even between the entry point and then when you get to the heart of it and how you start to work through it. Because this is something that we often experience. Our backgrounds are in debate. We were actually debate partners in college. And that worry from some people, oh, debate is just it's confrontational and it's argumentative and we want something that's more consensus based. But even when you offer that entry point of kind of consensus based or something that's not as confrontational, there's still some conflict there with trying to resolve something.
And I think that is where the growth occurs on for multiple parties. Where my mind went was, as a lifelong educator, it is my goal to create a safe space for my students. I don't want any student to feel alienated. Now, I do hold accountability, that there is civil discourse. You treat others with respect, especially when you have differing opinions. But it's incumbent upon the educator to create that safe space in the classroom. And that's the opening. That's the story opening. And then once that is there, that is where we can begin to engage. Debate does not have to be negative. I'm a law school dropout. Went to law school for 1 year, and it wasn't because of the debate that I didn't like it. It just wasn't my career path. In fact, I enjoy that, and I still enjoy that. I like to be challenged, and I think if I mirror that to my students, it works. I've witnessed that over 29 years, if that makes sense.
Great. Thank you.
You talked, about teaching a couple times, right? We talked about kind of authenticity. When students come into the classroom and now, right, a lot of them have been using or familiar with, some of these generative models for a while. And, they're not only their output, right, is kind of impacted by that, right? But kind of their own conversations, whether they're textual or otherwise. With these AIs, like, it's kind of hard to say, right? Because it's maybe more in the tension, but do you feel their voice is different? Maybe in both a literal sense, but also kind of just in, kind of a more figurative, like kind of how they're expressing themselves or what they're thinking. Like, do you see kind of whatever we want to define authenticity of the voices, right? If maybe it can or can't be a blank slate, but how do you see the language models like impacting that, even if it's just, your intuitive sense?
Can definitely tell when a student, I look at the use of AI on a continuum with no AI usage and then a lot of things in between and total AI reliance. I definitely can tell when a student has completely holistically relied on AI, because often they have not. It's vapid rhetoric. There is no voice, and I think because I've been an educator for so long and lifelong reader, when the voice is missing. Now, I will say, as students get more sophisticated, this is something that maybe we'll talk about in a bit, but the input, what humans input into the AI engine determines so much of what comes out. And I have read some things where there's been more of an intentional creative input, and then the outcome seems more authentic. But here again, I mean, that just chew. It's problematic. And I think, to get to your part of how I help students think about their voice is I don't ever want to give up the importance of discussion. That in the classroom, face to face, even like when I was teaching in a doctoral program, an EDD in education, even through the computer because it was virtual, those conversations are critical, even for us as adults, because our voices are evolving because we're changing as humans, hopefully. So our voice changes, but I think that here again, providing that safe space to explore who they are and engage in the conversations with each other as peers and also with me is critical.
That idea of what authenticity means anymore, I think, is part of what is throwing a lot of faculty off. I talk to a lot of colleagues and experiencing kind of a pedagogical vertigo where it's just like the ground's not really stable underneath us anymore because, some people might say that they can tell that something's written by AI, but maybe then when they see something where a student it is totally written by AI, but if the student put a lot of work into the prompting, discussion, preparation of materials, then okay, well then they did do a lot of work and it doesn't seem vapid and there's some real qualitative value to this output, but it's not what we would have considered authentic student writing before. Does that mean it's not authentic? No, it's a different kind of authenticity. And so that's something to negotiate and kind of manage. I'm curious how you see that perhaps going, especially as we're looking at both what you've already identified as maybe students developing a better facility with the tools and learning how to use them maybe more responsibly because they're thinking, I'm really putting a lot into this, but then it's writing it, as well as the tools just getting so much better. I mean, we were joking around a little bit about the use that I was using of Claude, and I often talk about how I'm using Claude in my writing and preparing questions for interviews and developing things that I feel like it's expanding my capabilities in some important ways, but it certainly makes me question, well, if it's different than what I would have done on my own, does that mean it's inauthentic, or does that mean it's a thought partner? Does that mean it's can I view it as a tool anymore if it's contributing in that way? It seems really complicated. How do you negotiate some of that?
I think it is a constant negotiation on, even when you get to that output and it does appear to be more authentic, however we're defining that. And that is such a difficult term to define and agree upon, I will say. There's still, I encourage human intervention even after the output because that, I do. And so, yes, I do encourage that. And to your point, AI is a tool. That is my belief. It does not replace humans. It cannot replace humans. I mean, I know there are a lot of doomsday sayers that will say, we're going to be run by robots. And I know and as a runner, I don't know if you all just saw that a robot just got the half marathon world record.
We just talked about that a couple of weeks ago in one of our updates, actually. Yeah, that was something.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I will never run that fast. So, and I will never generate text as quickly as AI. I mean, as humans, we have limitations. And technology, whether it's in the medical field or education or the space race, whatever, technology is to enhance what humans are capable of doing. And so I see it as an important AI. I see as an important disruptor that very much needs to be monitored with guardrails, with critical thinking, ethics, morals, because we know and we've already witnessed how it can be used for extreme harm and ill. And, to the point of a young man in California suiciding. I listened to a gentleman who talked to our Rotary Club in Bristol about the dangers of young people and chatbots and who's controlling them. There are, I'm not telling y'all anything, very sinister people out there. And one of the things that I did want to mention, talking about young people, and I can't remember the study right now, Anand, but it was about how AI is dangerous to young developing minds because those synapses that fire in what we know as learning don't fire when AI is doing all the work. So here again, I think these conversations are complicated. We're still figuring things out. What role does it play at different age levels? Yeah.
And I guess thinking about that role of where it goes, like even if it is developing much further, maybe it's that difference between replacement versus displacement. And so it's not thinking that we're going to not have a place, but it's going to be a very different placement for humans, depending upon on what we do with it.
And that's one of the things that I've heard employers say is that AI is not going to replace human jobs. It's humans who don't have AI literacy that will be replaced.
Yeah, it seems like necessary. It may not be sufficient. Seems like a necessary condition, in kind of the workforce these days, especially moving forward or for new hires. But the other thing I want to ask about, I know like a lot of your scholarly work is grounded in Appalachia and your interests. Of course, there's and these are related, right? There's questions of, how Appalachia is, represented, right, by humans, scholars, anybody, right? Um, who's kind of working in that area. And then, of course, there's questions about how Appalachia or places like Appalachia that are kind of maybe, kind of outside I guess the normal narrative, the dominant narrative, how they're represented in these models. Or how it's represented in these models, I guess I should say. Like, do you have any thoughts on, all your work in the field, those, discussions of kind of representation that probably arose like kind of pre generative AI, and then, where that conversation might be occurring now in terms of how the models are representing Appalachia, or how they may be able to, we've seen as, kind of the models expand and the trading data sets expand, you can add representations, but even adding that representation is, introduces some kind of value choices.
Yes, there is, as you noted, for literally centuries, Appalachia has been marginalized and reduced to stereotypes. And even to this day, certain writers have not contributed in a positive way to that. I'm not going to name any names right now, but I think that there is a real danger in relying on, and I actually have a case study that I can share now on the podcast, or I'm going to share at the conference, about how a colleague of mine at a state institution was outraged at a conference with some faculty members using, instead of, it was a community engagement class, And instead of engaging community, going out and engaging Appalachians, they created Appalachians with ChatGPT. And so consequently, given the web, because that's where it pulls from, all of that, the negative stereotyping is going to come to the fore. And it's not going to produce the very real, nuanced, diverse populations that exist in our region. Yeah. So I think that there are real dangers. And also, I'm sure you all have talked about the algorithms and how, they multiply. And if it's catching on to something, it's going to keep pulling from that. And it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, no matter what the group is. So I have real concerns to answer your question.
To ask you a little bit about that case study, I think what I find most fascinating about it is that this is a move that's happening with lots of populations. And there have been a lot of discussions, and I've heard some very let's say some optimistic views on the idea of simulating environments, simulating populations within, the use of generative AI to represent different groups. So maybe instead of polling actual people, you can run a simulated environment of a large population to be able to see how they'll react to a polling item or an election or what they might do in a market economy. That point about that development, like the construction of that community or that population, drawing from generally available materials. I think the assumption, of course, for many of us, well, it's just the way they're already represented. Why wouldn't we want to continue that representation? But there's not a chance for that population to better represent themselves within that. And it further kind of entrenches this marginalization, as you were talking about. Is there a good way, aside, like, let's say that we can't just stop those types of representation? Maybe is there a better way of going about that? Is there a better way to make sure that marginalized groups can control their own representation within generative AI or within population studies or within simulations? Obviously, in that case, you make a good case that shouldn't have been done that way. But what if we're worried that it's going to continue to be done? Mm-hmm. How do we counter that?
I think, the only way that can be countered, and that, oh my gosh, we're talking years and years of information that have been accumulated on the web. And to undo that and to provide a counter discourse, I think about counter narratives, even in print, that is a challenge. And this is, I think, one of the dangers of AI, that it continues to, as you said, they're marginalized groups. Who has access even to the internet? We think it's a universal thing, but it ain't, even where I live, between Bristol and Abingdon, we did not get broadband until it was like 6 years ago. And there are still places over in the coal fields where I can go and I don't have a cell phone signal. So I don't think that there is an easy fix to that. And it's something that pollsters and researchers and educators and students and politicians all need to be aware of. The paradigm that you're operating from is not the paradigm of so many others.
It's interesting, you talk about, how some people are, still disconnected, right? At least in terms of, broadband, which, you kind of need to do, but all but the simplest tasks, right? So it's kind of area that's disconnected, but then uh, they have trouble connecting all the areas, but they don't have any trouble, building the data centers, right? And, we've always had data centers, but, Virginia's become kind of the, maybe the most significant location, right, in the conversation globally. And I'm wondering, with your seat on the Virginia Council on Environmental Justice, um, kind of, there's a lot of issues kind of surrounding kind of data centers. What are some of the, when you think about environmental justice, and I remember kind of studying this, decades ago with a debate. It was a debate topic, and I learned about brownfields and all those types of things. But how do you kind of contextualize the kind of the data center uh, debate conversation, kind of in terms of environmental justice?
I think that it is another EJ issue. I just as we have seen, whether it's brownfields or, I think about the Kingston coal ash spill that occurred in Northeast Tennessee. I think it was in 2008. The cleanup, all that coal ash went to a poor Black community in Alabama. This is just another form of environmental injustice, because typically these, and not always, but typically and historically, not in my backyard. And if you've got the money and the political access, it ain't going to happen in your backyard. But, it also feeds into, Appalachia historically has been known as a national sacrifice zone because of our coal. First it was timber, then it was coal. And we're still extracting coal, not just deep mining, but also surface mining. And, with the energy required and our reliance still on fossil fuels, it remains to be an issue. And, I've taught environmental and social justice classes, and so oftentimes these communities are held hostage. They don't, because it's single industry, they don't have other opportunities to make the same kind of money, so they're held hostage. And it's not like the industry or corporations can go someplace else, because the fossil fuels exist in particular places. But I am very concerned not only about the environmental health, but the physical health of the humans. I've done a lot of work on black lung disease with coal miners in central Appalachia. It was on decline because of laws that were enacted under President Carter in the 70s, but it has skyrocketed again for a variety of reasons. But here again, it's a major concern. And we haven't even talked about the water consumption that is necessary for the cooling of these data centers. I know that in the Virginia legislature, there are several bills that are addressing data centers from different capacities. And like, for example, one is to require them to reveal the volume of water, the intake. Yeah. I mean, we have a long way to go to figure all this out. And I will say, one of the things that, I don't think that AI is going to go away. I don't think data centers are going to go away. I'm a realist in this regard. But one of my friends who is in a different industry, but is very environmentally conscious, sent me an article about the untapped, pun intended, opportunity with geothermal. And that could be something that is much more environmentally friendly, I'll say.
So when we think about communities that are grappling with this, figuring out, do we welcome a data center in or not? It seems like most of the reaction has been one extreme or the other. Either we welcome them in and we cover everything up because we have a tax base there that's going to benefit the community. And I have a colleague who was doing FOIA requests to get local boards of supervisors to release the information about how much water was going to be used. And they were really just trying to hide that. And then you have the other extreme where it's just the NIMBY response. We don't want it here. You can't do it here. Is there a case to be made that we need to be open to data centers coming into our communities because we have a better chance of regulating them, of making sure they use renewable energies, explore geothermal, have a way to clean water, to recycle water, to have better cooling systems and processes. Is there getting back to tension? Is it difficult to take an environmental justice position and welcome the data centers in with the idea that they're going to go somewhere and at least we can better monitor and regulate them? Or would it be better to say, no, let them go and manage it somewhere else? I mean, how do we work through that in practical terms, even if we recognize that by going through that, we are kind of infringing on some of the values that we have?
I think it is dependent on municipality leadership. That is really, just to your point about your colleague submitting FOIAs because the Board of Supervisors was withholding that critical information. If you are going to have a data center in your community, it is up to leadership to require and hold accountable on all the information and to mandate, like, if you're going to come here, you have to follow these policies and procedures instead of just turning a blind eye and saying, oh, it's all about well, and they get big tax breaks too, which I don't understand. I mean, so yeah, I would say the bottom line is it depends on leadership. And that's why it is so critical that the community votes. That's where, no matter your race, class, gender, go vote because they are the ones who are going to be in charge if you have these data centers come in.
We can focus a lot on the liberal arts, right? Especially with the center, and it's kind of a broad conceptualization. Lots of times when I have these kind of opportunities and to ask, like, what do you think of when you think of kind of the liberal arts? Maybe what are some core identifying principle or idea, and how do you think that can help facilitate these discussions, whether they're related to authenticity, the environment, kind of the overlap, kind of between the two, the contextualization, Appalachia. How do you think we could kind of bring that forward in humanities-focused education?
I think of the liberal arts as an education in critical thinking, in creative thinking, in what does it mean to be an engaged, informed, contributing citizen. It invites you. This is what I loved about being a philosophy major, even though my mechanical engineering father asked me, what the heck are you going to do with that when you graduate? Philosophy invited me to think about ideas I had never even thought about. And so, interestingly, I just finished writing a keynote address that I'm giving tomorrow at Emory and Henry University for the Mosaic ceremony, which is a courting ceremony before graduation on Saturday for underrepresented groups. And I use Bell Hooks as my launching pad, and how she talks about the importance of not only decolonizing our minds, but our imaginations. And I feel like the liberal arts do that for us. They help guide us to think about how the very strong social messaging we get oftentimes is used to control, to further power, to disenfranchise. So I very much see the liberal arts playing a critical role in AI for all of those reasons.
Thinking about the keynote that you're giving and some of the discussion we've had about the way that AI can homogenize the voice, it can bring people toward a kind of more toward the median and removing a lot of the difference. Unfortunately, some of the arguments given for expanding data centers, expanding the technology, and expanding AI is that it democratizes access, that it no longer requires sometimes the same education or access to education or to means of technology. It's cheaper, it's more readily available for people to be able to write, translate, express themselves. Back to the tension between the two. Is there a way to reconcile the two? Is there a way to move forward? Is it about recognizing that tension?
So I'm involved in this open platform called CityGov. And these are some friends of mine who live in New York. They are going through, they're two of my friends, and they're going through a master's program at Harvard. And Sam came up with CityGov. And he told me, he said, I employ your language because this is what Theresa said, trying to reconcile. AI is a part of it. It doesn't have to be for people who are contributing articles to this open platform. But what AI does, not everybody is a writer. And I recognize that as a writer. But there are people who have incredible experience and best practices that should be shared, whether it's with other municipalities or educators or healthcare providers, what business, whatever the realm. And you might not be a great writer, but you know what you're doing and you've got a track record of proven success. Your democratized voice through AI makes that what you know accessible to others. I mean, I think about my two sons are very different. My older son is very much an existential nerd like his mother. My younger son, school was not for him. He works in the field in construction, in commercial construction. Both of them are brilliant. If my younger son wanted to share best practices, writing is not his thing. He hates it. But if AI would enable him to share what he knows are best practices in the field. I mean, he educates me all the time just by talking to me. Look at what he could do through AI. So that's how I see that platform.
Yeah, I was thinking just about a couple of the tensions I always see. I've been telling on them, well, if we don't build more data centers, then the people who are going to get access to the AI are like the biggest corporations in the military. It's going to get really expensive, right? And already kind of see some of that lately, right? And if we don't have more data centers, then it's you and me. We might lose a kind of meaningful access. And then I think, well, I don't know if you saw, but Anthropic just made a deal with Elon Musk to, use all his data centers. And I kind of really never used the Grok. I tried it a couple times. I would never pay because I'm not like an Elon Musk fan. And the other ones could do the same thing I can that I needed it for. So really wasn't much of a moral quandary, Um, But now that line's blurred. I love Claude, and probably I do use that all the time, right? So it's like, well, what am I supposed to do now, right? Am I really just gonna, I'll keep using Claude, but it's just there aren't just so many clear answers, to lots of these quandaries, right? It's a general purpose technology. It's going to be used for things we like and we don't like, and when you have conversations with, sometimes people, I think they really, they're very, I don't want to use AI because it causes environmental harm, or how do you kind of like engage those conversations when you meet maybe extremists on kind of one side or the other?
I have both in my life. In fact, I think about my colleagues at Transylvania University in Brasov, Romania, where I did my Fulbright, and they are in the Faculty of Letters, and they have a zero tolerance policy for AI. Now, that doesn't mean that Romania isn't employing AI and creating data centers, because I just read a newsletter today where that is, they were talking about a new data center, but that's their position. I even have a colleague at Radford University who, do you remember Blue Books, y'all?
Yeah, right.
They're going back to Blue Books, and, there's something to be said about that. But I feel like to put your head in the sand is not doing your students a favor. I'm not dismissive of my friends and colleagues who do that. I understand the principle behind it, but to think that AI is not going to be a part of our lives, I think, yeah, that's just not realistic. So Stefan, I don't know. I think it's just a tough conversation when you're having it on both sides. And I try to, I'm a negotiator, and try to be a peacemaker and find that middle ground, and yeah, engage in authentic, meaningful discussion.
And that's what we hope you do when you come to campus in July. That'll be great. We'll put you to work as the peacemaker and see how we can bridge some of those differences wherever possible.
Thank you.
We're
Wish me
so
luck.
appreciative of you taking your time to talk with us. The last question I just wanted to ask, what gives you hope, and maybe in a Deridian and or sense, and or what's the question you've not yet figured out how to answer?
I think what gives me hope is that people are pushing back on just this intense, going to the conversation about corporations. And we are in a for-profit society. But I think it is so important that people push back on that. And I see it happening. I don't know that it's happening at the pace that should be happening. The question that there are so many questions, and there are questions I don't even know are questions. And that's part of life too. But, my hope is that, I'm looking outside my window. I live in the most beautiful part of the world, in the Appalachian Mountains. And I do not want people to substitute the artificial for the real. And I think about the natural environment, going back to the origins of place-based education. And, I think about E.O. Wilson's biophilia hypothesis, and that he says there's an innate desire that humans possess to be connected to nature. I believe in that. And I hope that, and I see evidence of that persisting in spite of the artificial intelligence proliferation, if you will.
Well, that's great. Thank you for that. For anybody that's watching that wants to learn more about your work, where can they find you other than on July 22nd, 23rd at UMW?
They can just do a Google search. They can do an AI search and find me.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, thanks so much for joining us. I look forward to welcoming you to campus and enjoy that beautiful nature that you live in.
I indeed will. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.